Your Story with Melinda Estabrooks, an exclusive presentation of Faith Strong Today.
And welcome back to another show on Your Story with Melinda. And this show is going to be one that's a little different than most shows. This one's a little bit more serious, but it's going to be one that I know is going to tug at your heart, and we're going to learn a lot. My guest today is Les Sillars. He is a journalist for over 20 years. He has written for World Magazine, The Weekly Standard, The National Post, Touchstone Magazine. He's a journalism professor at Patrick Henry College in Virginia and holds graduate degrees in Old Testament studies and journalism. And you can see that I'm holding up his latest book called Intended for Evil, a survivor's story of love, faith, and courage in the Cambodian killing fields. And I so appreciate his book on this story. Also with me, I have my good friend Karen Petersen. She is the Vice President of Global Learning for the Field Collaborative, and you can find out all about what she does at thefieldcollaborative.com. She's been to Cambodia 9 times in the past 10 years, training women in leadership development, and that's a huge thing that she's doing with her team. So welcome both of you to the show, Les and Karen. Let's kick this off because there's a lot to this story that you've written, Les, and I know that there's a lot that we can learn for people that are listening and watching all over the world about the Cambodian killing fields, about the Khmer Rouge, lots for us to learn. But I know that Karen has a question because I know Cambodia is really close to your heart, Karen.
It is. And having been there, I recognize a lot of the backstory of what happened there, but it'll be great for you to kind of fill in the people who are listening. Mm-hmm. But anyway, let's just kick it off. I would love to know, how did you meet Radha, and then what inspired you to tell his story? Mm-hmm. It's a really unique story, but what inspired you to tell his story?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. A colleague of mine here at the college, his name is David Aikman. He was a longtime correspondent for Time magazine. Mm-hmm. He'd reported from Asia and Europe and the Middle East, and through a mutual acquaintance, he had heard about this guy named Radha who had these incredible stories about the Khmer Rouge. And so we're standing talking in the hall one day, and he said to me, "Yeah, this Radha, he wants somebody to write down his stories. You should give him a call." And I didn't know anything about the Khmer Rouge. Like, all I knew about them was a hazy recollection that I'd had from watching the killing fields when I was in high school. And so I had no idea what I was getting into. But I gave him a call, and he was telling me just these incredible stories about the horrible things that he had seen, the life that he'd endured in the cooperatives, and about his forced marriage. And I'm thinking, wow, this is kind of amazing. I didn't have time to deal with them right then. This is in the fall of 2013. But I said I would do some reading, and I would call him back. And so I started to read, and I was just both kind of horrified and fascinated by what I discovered about the Khmer Rouge. I mean, they're largely forgotten today, but they were easily one of the most totalitarian regimes in modern history, if not the most totalitarian regime. They had killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. It had led to untold misery. And they had this really remarkable idea of what it takes to build a perfect society.
Okay, so let's talk to me about this, because for a lot of people, we're consumed with recent younger people like Syria. Some of us remember atrocities of the Vietnam War. We remember the Tutsis and the Hutus in Rwanda. So some of us recollect and remember that, but I would say many people have no idea what happened in Cambodia in the 1970s. Like, nobody, like Khmer Rouge, what are you talking about? The killing fields, it was at a movie. Like, talk to us about that. Like, what happened then? Like, give us some historical context of what happened and why.
Absolutely. In the early 1970s, there was a civil war in Cambodia. And on the one side, there was the U.S.-backed Khmer Republic. And that had it was indirectly involved in the Vietnam War. And on the other side were the Khmer Rouge fighters. They were a communist guerrilla group. They were out in the jungles, and they were backed by the communist Vietnamese. And so there was this 5-year civil war that went on between 70 and 75. And in 1975, on April 17th, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh. They won, and in fact, they took Phnom Penh 2 weeks prior to the fall of South Vietnamese to the North Vietnamese. And at that time, it was the leader, Pol Pot, had a vision for the society that he wanted to create. He wanted to create a perfectly pure communist society and perfectly Khmer communist society. And he immediately set about trying to implement this program. He emptied the cities, he emptied them at gunpoint, he forced everybody into the countryside where people were set to work digging roads, digging canals, growing rice by hand, and it just set off almost a 4-year regime of just really remarkable misery. I mean, he was planning to turn the country into kind of a communist utopia, a communist agrarian utopia, but he turned the country into one big labor camp. You know, he
Wow.
cut off communication with the outside world, and he forced people to live in these communes. He told them how they would live, how they would dress, when they would eat, sleep, work, who they would marry, everything. It was just simply astonishing.
And took children away from their parents. That was one of the big things. Was they broke up the family.
And so
children
what's
away.
the
That
purpose
was
of this,
ridiculous.
right? Yeah, so you've got control, but what was the purpose? Was he trying to make a new society, or what was the purpose of all of this?
He absolutely was trying to create a completely new society. He had a vision for what he called the new socialist man. It was somebody that had no trace of individualism left at all. He was trying to create a society where everybody worked for the good of the collective. And they had this vision, and some of them really did believe that if they came up with this society, if they managed to create this new socialist man, that they would have a society where everybody was equal, everybody was well fed, everybody was looked after. You know, it was going to be this wonderful place. But in reality, of course, it was a horrible, horrible place. It led to disaster almost immediately, and it went downhill from there. So yeah, it was. He had a vision, and it just it didn't work, and it was never going to work.
One of the really key things that he did was, Les, you can comment on this too from your research, but they first started by killing all the educated people. So if anybody spoke a foreign language, they were killed. Even if people wore glasses, it meant they could read, so they were killed. And they burned the books and the library. Anything that was connected to anything foreign was burned, which of course impacted the Christians and the church, and we'll probably get into that along the way.
Yeah, it was really, and now there's a bit of a misconception that the Khmer Rouge were anti-education, and they weren't exactly. They had a 4-year plan that called for schools to be built and everybody to be educated. Mm-hmm. It wasn't that they were anti-education per se. It was that they were anti anything that had the slightest hint of Western individualism.
Yeah.
So this is why all the books were burned, and anybody who had been educated under the old way, right?
Yeah.
It was under the old corrupt society, and so they had to be gotten rid of. Yeah. They were considered there was the old people and the new people. We won't get into that now, but they really did try and destroy everything about the old society and replace it with their new society.
So let's talk about this. So we thank you for giving us sort of the context of it, and then you come in and write this book, right, mm-hmm. about Radha. In and amongst all of this, you sort of honed in on one particular person and his story. Don't give it all away, because I want everybody to run out and buy your book. Okay, so I don't want you to give me all, don't give me all the meat of it. But tell me why the story. Give me a little tease of sort of the gist of him, and then I want to kind of talk about how the story has changed you. But Radha's story. And why his? I mean, there's probably a number of people you could have interviewed and then written a book about, but for some reason it was Radha. And why is that?
Well, there's a practical reason in that Radha was the guy that I knew, and I met him through David Aikman, and he started telling me the story. Radha's story is unusual in that he was a Christian when the Khmer Rouge took over. He'd grown up in a Hindu family. He's actually ethnically Indian. He's part of a small minority in Cambodia, but he was born in Cambodia. And he became a Christian in 1973, 2 years before the fall of Phnom Penh. And so he had this really unusual perspective of watching all of this happen, but also having at the same time this feeling that God was in control, that God knew what was going on. And throughout the story, he endures some really horrible things. He loses most of his family, are killed. They die of starvation or disease, and one is beaten to death. But he becomes at times, I think, very angry at God. He's often feels like he's arguing with God. He doesn't really understand why this could happen. But what he did have, though, is a belief that God was in control, and it gave him hope. He knew that there was a God, and he didn't ever doubt that there was a God. He was angry, he was frustrated, but through it all, he could survive because he had that hope that he wasn't there entirely alone. And so that's what, as I was talking to Radha and working on this story, I could really identify with him in the sense that I would have been angry too. I would have been shocked, I would have been horrified, I would have been frustrated. All of those emotions that anybody would have felt going through all of those things. Radha felt all those things, and he said once, he didn't feel that his faith kept him strong because he didn't feel strong. But at the same time, he persevered. He kept on going because he had, I think, at root this faith that God was there.
What I think is amazing is that the resilience of people in those circumstances blows me away. Like, it seems like in every person, I don't know. I mean, is there certain people that have it, or do we all have it? But that when you're faced with incredible hardship, there's something that can rise up and keep you going. Because when I've read through the story, it's like I would be done. Like, I honestly, with that kind of emotional pain and heartache and suffering, for me, reading through this I would be like, and I'm out. Gone. And you read this, and what courageous man, what a man of incredible resilience. And you just sort of go, you have to step back and go, how do you do that? How do you keep going and living to one day come out of it and tell your story? It's incredible.
It really is.
It was tremendously humbling to sit and talk about it. And every week he would tell me something that would absolutely make my jaw drop. He had some horrible thing that had happened to him, and I would be like, wow, how can anybody go through this? And to meet him now, he doesn't seem like the kind of guy who is this super strong and courageous kind of. I mean, he's courageous. He does a lot of great work in Cambodia still, of course. But I was humbled because I was thinking to myself, would I have been able to stand all of that? Would I have been able to survive through that? And I'm not sure I could have. I mean, I would like to think that I could have. But I don't even know for sure. It's one of those things that until you actually go through it, you can never really know, whether or not you have the faith and resilience to actually make it through.
So so in the context of this, Radha is a Christian, and he's going through this situation of the Khmer Rouge.
A remarkably young Christian.
A young Christian going through this, yeah.
Into his faith.
So his story is about how he survived, is that right, through this? And how did he get thrown into all of this? Like, how come he didn't, escape or run away? Like, why is he within the center of this and having to go through this? What can you give us a little bit of that to tease us in the story?
He and his family were living in Phnom Penh when the Khmer Rouge came in and they evacuated everybody. And they evacuated them on foot. So they were pushed out into the countryside on foot, where they were sent to live in these cooperatives. And so there were people that tried to escape, but it wasn't easy to escape. They would have had to trek through very, very dangerous jungles. There was a war going on, of course, in Vietnam to the east, and Thailand wasn't terribly safe. Terribly a whole lot safer to try and get through there. The Khmer Rouge, of course, were aware that there were lots of people that didn't want to stay, and so they kept close track. There were landmines and booby traps, all over the jungle, certainly on the Thailand border. So it isn't like you could just kind of pack up your family and walk across the border and be safe. I mean, you were stuck there. If they caught you traveling from town to town without the proper travel papers, you could be sent to prison, tortured, probably executed. There was an astonishing level of control that would have been terribly intimidating. Mm-hmm. So how do you get stuck in it, and why do you stay through it? Well, he didn't really have much choice. It finally ended when the communist Vietnamese, they realized how unstable the country was, and Pol Pot had been provoking them on their border, and so finally the Vietnamese rolled in '79 and kicked them out. They defeated the Khmer Rouge initially, but that just started off another 10-year civil war.
Warfare. Yeah.
So he was in there because he had to be there, and there wasn't any place else to go.
Okay. Oh.
So I want to bring it sort of the story into today.
Mm-hmm.
So, listeners that are listening, it's an interesting story that happened a long time ago. What's the relevance for today?
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions that I had that I kind of played with a little bit is, this was a despotic leader who sought to impose his view of reality, his vision for the future on a large mass of people. And would you ever be able to see something like that happening in Canada or the U.S.? That's just a throw-out question, but what's the relevance for us today?
Right. No, I mean, we are a long way from having a communist regime like the Khmer Rouge take over either Canada or the U.S. I mean,
Right.
Or anywhere in Western Europe. I mean, this is, it's highly improbable. But at the same time, there are some of the foundational ideas of who the Khmer Rouge were, and what made them what they were. We still see some of those ideas today, and they're tremendously destructive and harmful. One of the things was that human beings are blank slates, right? And if you can apply enough force, you can change human beings into anything that you want them to be. That there is no such thing as human nature, and that's why they thought they could create this new communist man, who The new socialist man didn't need friends, didn't need work that mattered, didn't need family, didn't need faith, didn't need free markets, didn't need any of the institutions that we have in our reasonably free society, and so Pol Pot thought that he could just wipe all those away and replace them. Well, it turned out that no, you can't. He tried, and he tried to use a lot of force, but in the end, those are the institutions, those are the things that make up human nature, which are important for every reasonably free society to have.
Right.
And if you try and sweep those things away, it just leads to disaster. And so we see this a little bit today when people say, well, there are no limits to human nature. People can be whatever they want to be. They can, if they want to change their identity in foundational ways, then why shouldn't they be able to do that?
Right.
But no, I don't think that's true. If we are created beings, if we are created in the image of God, and He has created us in certain ways, and if our society doesn't respect the limits that are imposed by that creation on us as a society, we will simply be going down, I guess I would say, destructive paths.
Yeah, Les, that's a good thought, because one of the things is, and one of the questions you actually had and sort of posed is, why is it important for us today to remember the killing fields, this story from the 1970s? I think it's important. We're always like, let's look ahead, let's look to the future, but it's always important for us to remember the past. Not live there, but remember it so that we can learn as we go about and learn our lessons.
Yeah.
Why is it important for us today? I mean, you're thinking, and I said this earlier in the interview, in our conversation, that there has to be something that we need to take from this incredibly, honestly, it's horrific moment in our history, and learn from it. And so why is it important that we hear this, learn from it, and even study and know about this situation?
Right. And we certainly, even if we don't actually revert to that kind of a society, even if we don't, even if a totalitarian government seems like it's a long way off to where we are now, we have to look back, and we have to recognize that that harmful ideas and harmful methods of government can come upon us even when we're not quite aware that they're coming upon us. We have to be able to recognize the signs and the things that are happening in our society that are leading us down harmful and destructive paths. I think one of the things that really struck me was that many of the observers of the Khmer Rouge, they're trying to explain this, and they say, well, how could people be so evil? Why were the Khmer Rouge so incredibly evil? And I think that that's actually the wrong question. I mean, there are some good answers for that will account for some of the factors that went into why the Khmer Rouge were what they were. Why they had an ideology. There were certain historical circumstances, all of those kinds of things. But when we look at the Khmer Rouge, we also have to see ourselves. The question is not so much how could the Khmer Rouge be so evil, but why aren't we all more like the Khmer Rouge? Why are we not as evil as we possibly could be? This is a part of our fallen human nature. The people in Cambodia who did terrible things, and there were perfectly ordinary people. They were farmers and they were tradesmen and so on. The people that joined the Khmer Rouge, many of them did horrible and unspeakable things that they probably wouldn't have considered. Maybe 5 or maybe even 2 years earlier, right. And yet they did those things. And so we have to recognize that evil is a part of every one of us. And we have to recognize, well, what is it that keeps us from all being like that? And I think it's God's grace. It's working in our lives, in our societies. It's in the institutions of a civil society that keep evil from breaking out and spreading from person to person and heart to heart. You look at the Khmer Rouge, and and if you talk to people who lived through it, right? They will say that they're people that they knew, neighbors, friends, and so on, would end up doing really, unspeakable things. They would execute other people. They would cut their throats. They would beat them to death with hoe handles. And after the regime is over, right, in some sense, they go back to being those normal people, the people that weren't, the Khmer Rouge who managed to kind of blend back into the population. And you wonder, well, how could that be? Well, if we look at those and say that no, the Khmer Rouge were monsters, they were homicidal maniacs, that's got nothing to do with me today, I think that's the wrong attitude. I really do think that we have to consider, what is it in our own hearts that keeps us from being, from following a path of really deep, dark, and destructive evil.
So, Les, a question that I've got is, we can look at this from sort of an institutional perspective, that we have, like, the institutions of civil society put checks and balances around us to, counter that evil that we find within ourselves. For your own personal story, how did this impact you? Mm-hmm. How did this impact your faith, your own faith? Where did it take you?
Well, there were two things really that struck me as I was writing this book. One is I'm deeply humbled to look at how people managed, how Radha, managed to survive all of these horrible things, and to ask myself, could I have shown as much faith and courage as Radha did? It also gave me a little bit of a different perspective on the troubles that we go through in our own society. We're going through a fairly contentious election down in here, down here in the U.S., and a lot of people are very concerned that it's going to lead to really dire consequences for our society one way or another. Mm-hmm. And obviously, we should be concerned about these things, but we also have to have a little perspective on it. Also have to recognize that God's still on his throne. And the day after the election, we're going to wake up. And the sun will still come up, and God will still be there to provide the grace that we need to accomplish the things that he has called for us to do from day to day. Right. And so I look at this. This has given me a profound sense of gratitude for the society that we do live in, and for the freedom that I enjoy here, even if the political situation changes down here, and our freedoms are in some sense circumscribed or curtailed. Right. We can still think about people like Radha, who managed to maintain their faith even in the direst of circumstances. And if Radha can maintain his faith even in those kinds of circumstances, why can I not maintain mine, no matter what happens around me?
Right. Les, that's why I love stories, and I'm so grateful for your words here and the time that you took the past year to listen to Radha and listen to his heart and his story. I love that when we write a story about somebody, to sort of help them bring their experiences to life. We're changed ourselves. You know, it's a beautiful connection of humanity, right? I'm so grateful too, Les, that you bring to the surface again the Cambodian killing fields, so that we don't forget what happened in the past and that we can learn in the present and the future. I think that's a profound thing that as I'm listening to you, thinking there is that part of us that could do evil, and what are those sort of checks and balances and community and faith that keep us from not, and choices. I think that's a good learning too. And I think for anybody listening and watching, you need to pick up this book. This is probably not one for just light reading, is it, Les?
It's a story.
But it's a story. And I think that everybody needs to get this book, this Intended for Evil, a survivor story of Radha, of his story of love, faith, and courage in the Cambodian killing fields. And I know that we all can pick this up and learn something about ourselves, about humanity.
It has just one interjection is it has a really interesting twist about community, about Christian community, and how God brought someone into his life that even though it was only the two of them, they had at least that much Christian community. So
she's
just
doing
a little
tease,
teaser.
Les.
Little teaser
Les,
there.
she's doing a little teaser. Good, Karen. That's good.
Yeah, because Christian community matters. It does really matter.
So Les, thank you. And just last thoughts. What's your hope for this story? What's your hope that when somebody picks this up or listens to the podcast, watches the podcast, what do you hope that they'll get out of this?
I would hope that the person can live Radha's story along with them, and they can recognize that no matter how deep their own despair is, whatever their own circumstances are, that they have reason to have hope, that they have reason to have faith, that God is looking after them, and even in the very darkest of dark times, that God can still make a way to work through their lives and to bring them to a better place. I mean, there were lots of believers who died under the Khmer Rouge, so it's not to say that God will make everything work out in the end in this life. But he really does have a plan for all of us, and I think that Radha's example of courage and faith is a really humbling but yet hopeful and encouraging story.
Well, Les Sillars, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Please thank Radha for sharing his story with you, and then to us and to the world.
He's living in Cambodia now, is that right, Radha?
No, he's been living in Seattle since about the late 80s.
Okay.
He started off pastoring Khmer churches in Seattle, but he's still since the early 90s, he's been going back to Cambodia regularly as a missionary. He's now a full-time missionary, but he divides his time between Seattle and Cambodia.
Oh, okay.
Beautiful.
Okay.
So Intended for Evil, the story of a young man who loses most of his family in the mind-numbing brutality of the 1975 Cambodian genocide, but clings to hope amidst despair. He eventually comes to the U.S., later to return and share his faith. And so thanks, Les Sillars, for sharing his story with us.
Very cool.
Go out and get this book.
Yeah, that's really good.
Go out and get this book.
Me, Melinda, I'm very grateful to be here. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Thanks so much.
Right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Your Story with Melinda Estabrooks. Listen for new episodes every Monday and subscribe to the podcast at faithstrongtoday.com.